The detail I kept returning to in this story was not the announcement itself. It was the sound of 3 brass keys touching a white dinner plate while 12 people sat completely still. The man who placed them there did not raise his voice. He did not overturn a chair, demand an explanation, or ask anyone to choose a side. He simply understood that the evening had changed the terms of his life, and he responded with the same care he used when determining whether a structure could still carry its intended weight. You're watching Diary of Owen. Let's go back to that Christmas dinner. The first sound I noticed was the radiator knocking behind the sideboard. 3 dull taps came through the wall, followed by a thin metallic shiver in the copper pipe. The heating system in my mother-in-law's house had made the same noise every winter for 9 years, usually just after the dining room filled with people, and the thermostat was turned up to 74. It was 6:42 on Christmas evening. Outside, wet snow had begun sticking to the hedges along Alder Row. Through the dining room window, I could see the colored lights on the opposite house bleeding softly into the glass. Red, green, red again. My reflection sat between them, pale and slightly distorted, wearing the charcoal sweater Elise had bought me 2 Christmases earlier. There were 12 of us around the table. Elise sat across from me rather than beside me. That should have been the first clear sign. Her usual place was the chair on my left, where she could reach beneath the table and rest 2 fingers against my wrist when her father began telling the same stories about municipal contracts or when her younger brother drank too quickly. That evening she had placed herself between her mother and her cousin Tessa, leaving the chair beside me to her Uncle Graham. I had noticed the change when we sat down, but I had not challenged it. By then, I had spent 6 weeks noticing changes and giving each one a harmless explanation. The turkey had been carved at 6:18. The gravy boat moved clockwise. Someone opened a second bottle of wine. Elise's father, Martin, asked me whether the restoration project on the Bellwether Library would still finish by spring. I told him the west stairwell had revealed more water damage than the preliminary survey showed, but the load-bearing masonry was intact. We could replace what had deteriorated without changing the building's essential form. Elise looked at me when I said that, only for a second. Then she lowered her eyes to her plate. I worked as a structural engineer, mostly on old civic buildings that had outlived the people who first calculated them. Libraries, courthouses, railway stations, stone schools with slate roofs and timber beams darkened by 100 winters. My job was not to admire appearances. It was to understand what stood behind them. A wall could look straight while carrying weight it had never been designed to hold. A ceiling could remain perfectly level until the final hour before failure. Cracks rarely began where ordinary people expected them to. They traveled along concealed weaknesses, emerging far from the place where the original damage occurred. I had learned to distrust the visible surface. I had not yet learned to apply that discipline to my marriage. Elise and I had been together for 11 years and married for 8. We met when I was 30 and she was 28, during a public consultation about converting an abandoned textile mill into apartments. I had been sent to answer questions about foundation settlement. Elise had come as a local reporter, carrying a green notebook and a pen she kept clicking whenever someone avoided giving her a direct answer. Afterward, she approached me near the folding coffee table and asked whether the building was actually safe or whether I had been paid to make the word unsafe sound less alarming. I told her safety was not a mood, it was a calculation. She wrote that down. Our first dinner lasted 3 hours. She had a way of making concentration feel like affection. When I spoke, she listened without preparing her response. When she disagreed, she leaned forward rather than away. She asked precise questions and remembered the answers months later. During our second winter together, my father died unexpectedly at 63. A clot reached his lung while he was repairing a fence behind the house where I grew up. Elise drove me through freezing rain at 2:10 in the morning, packed my clothes when my hands could not manage the buttons, and sat beside me through every conversation that followed. She did not try to improve my grief. She stayed close enough that I did not have to carry it alone. That was the woman I married. We bought our house 5 months after the wedding. It stood at 14 Marlow Crescent, a narrow brick property with a blue front door, 2 upstairs bedrooms, and a neglected pear tree leaning over the back fence. The kitchen tiles were cracked. The chimney needed repointing. There was a diagonal fracture above the living room window that frightened Elise until I showed her it followed an old plaster joint rather than the brick beneath it. The asking price was $318,000. We had $63,400 between us. $48,000 came from the apartment I had owned before we met. Elise contributed most of the remaining amount from savings and a small inheritance from her grandmother. We agreed the difference did not matter. We were not measuring who had brought which brick into the marriage. Both our names went on the deed. For 6 years, we rebuilt the house slowly. We stripped wallpaper until midnight. We found newspapers from 1976 beneath the attic insulation. Elise painted the dining room twice because the first shade of gray looked purple after sunset. I built shelves across the back wall of the living room, and she filled them with novels, framed photographs, and objects that meant nothing to visitors but everything to us. A blue bowl from our honeymoon, my father's brass compass, a ceramic fox she had owned since she was 9. On the eastern wall, we marked our heights as a joke after too much wine one New Year's Eve. Elise stood barefoot while I drew a pencil line above her head. Then she insisted I do the same. The marks were still there that Christmas morning, hidden behind the tall plant she had moved into the corner. We had never had children. At first that was a decision. Later it became a subject we handled carefully, then avoided altogether. Elise had wanted to wait until her journalism career became less uncertain. I had wanted to finish paying down the renovation loan. Each year provided a reasonable argument for postponement. By the time we began speaking seriously about it, she was 37 and I was 39. There were appointments, blood tests, calendars, a specialist who used phrases like diminished probability while pointing to diagrams neither of us wanted to study. We tried for 18 months. Then Elise said she needed a pause. The pause became permanent without either of us naming it. That loss did not destroy us, but it altered the internal distribution of weight. We became more polite, more protective. We stopped asking questions that might cause the other person pain and gradually stopped asking difficult questions at all. From the outside, our marriage remained straight. Inside, certain connections had begun to loosen. The first visible crack appeared in early November. Elise worked as communications director for the Calder Arts Foundation by then. She had left reporting 3 years earlier because the newspaper kept reducing staff, and the foundation offered better pay and predictable hours. Her job involved donors, exhibitions, public statements, and evening events, where everyone wore black and spoke quietly beside unfinished glasses of wine. On November 7th, she came home at 11:36. She had texted earlier to say a sponsored dinner was running late. That was plausible. Her coat smelled of cold air and someone else's cedar cologne, but crowded restaurants collect traces of strangers. I kissed her forehead and asked whether she had eaten enough. She said she had. 4 days later, she changed the passcode on her phone. She said the foundation had introduced stricter security requirements. That was also plausible. On November 19th, I woke at 2:14 and found her standing by the bedroom window with the phone held low against her chest. The screen lit her face blue. When she noticed me, she turned it off and said Tessa was having trouble with her boyfriend. I asked whether Tessa needed help. Elise said no. She returned to bed but did not touch me. I lay awake listening to the rain strike the gutter outside, counting the seconds between heavier bursts. In structural inspections, repeated intervals matter. A single event may be accidental. A pattern is information. Still, I said nothing. I had reasons for my silence, although none of them were as noble as I believed at the time. I told myself trust required restraint. I told myself suspicion could damage a marriage more efficiently than truth. I told myself Elise had supported me through my father's death and the lean years when I worked 60-hour weeks. She had earned the benefit of every doubt I possessed. The less flattering truth was that I feared the answer. An engineer does not avoid testing a beam because the result may be inconvenient. A husband sometimes does. On December 2nd, I found a hotel receipt in the pocket of her wool coat. The coat had fallen from the hook in the hallway. I picked it up, and a folded strip of paper slid onto the floor. The Meriton Hotel. Room service coffee for 2. The timestamp was 7:08 in the morning on November 21st. Elise had told me she spent that night at her mother's house because Martin had gone to the emergency room with chest pain. He had, in fact, gone to the hospital. I had spoken to him the next morning. I had assumed Elise slept in the guest room after staying with her mother. The hotel was 11 miles from her parents' house. I stood beneath the hallway light holding the receipt between my thumb and forefinger. The paper had been folded 4 times, each crease pressed sharply. I remember noticing the total. $23.60. That number stayed with me because the mind sometimes chooses a small fact when the larger one is too heavy to lift. I photographed the receipt, then I returned it to the pocket exactly as I had found it. Elise came home 40 minutes later carrying groceries. She kissed my cheek, placed oranges in the blue bowl from our honeymoon, and asked whether I could repair the loose handle on the upstairs window before the weather worsened. I said I would look at it Saturday. We ate lentil soup at the kitchen counter. She told me about a dispute involving exhibition insurance. I watched her tear bread into smaller pieces while she spoke. Her wedding ring clicked against the ceramic bowl each time she reached for the spoon. I did not confront her. That decision may sound weak. For several days I believed it was. But by then, I understood enough to know that one receipt would lead only to explanations. There would be a conference room booked at the hotel, an exhausted colleague, a misplaced coat, some arrangement of facts technically possible and emotionally useless. I did not want an argument. I wanted the full load path. On December 5th, I reviewed our shared financial records. There were no obvious hotel charges. Elise used a separate credit card for work expenses, which the foundation reimbursed. Our checking account looked ordinary. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, the annual payment for home insurance. Then I noticed 3 transfers from our joint savings account. $2,000 on October 28th, $3,500 on November 14th, $4,000 on November 29th. Each transfer had gone to Elise's personal account. We had always moved money freely between accounts, but sums above $1,000 were usually discussed. The description field on each transfer contained the same word: personal. Our joint savings balance had fallen from $41,870 to $32,370. When I asked that evening whether she had moved money for something related to her mother, she paused for less than a second. She said she was considering a surprise renovation for my 40th birthday and had not wanted me to see contractor names. My birthday was 7 months away. I told her that sounded generous. She studied my face, perhaps searching for suspicion. I gave her none. 2 days later, she suggested we host Christmas morning at our house, but attend dinner at her parents' place. She said it would be easier than cooking for everyone. We had hosted Christmas dinner 3 years in a row. Elise usually planned the menu before Thanksgiving. That year, she packed the serving platters into a cupboard and said she wanted something simpler. The shape of the coming event began to emerge, although I could not yet identify its purpose. On December 10th, I spoke to a lawyer. Her name was Amara Voss. She worked from a second-floor office above a pharmacy on Linden Street. I chose her because she specialized in collaborative separation rather than litigation. I had not decided to leave my marriage. I told myself I was gathering information. That is the phrase people use when knowledge feels disloyal. Amara listened while I explained the receipt, the transfers, and the silence between Elise and me. She did not speculate about infidelity. She asked practical questions: whose names were on the deed, what remained on the mortgage, whether we had a prenuptial agreement, whether either of us had received gifts or inheritances used toward the property. The house had been appraised the previous spring at $612,000. The mortgage balance was $187,400. After estimated selling costs, our combined equity was roughly $390,000. Amara explained that if we separated, neither person could simply give the house away by handing over keys. Ownership required legal documents, financial disclosures, lender approval, and, in some cases, refinancing. I understood. The keys would be symbolic. The law would come later. She also told me something that altered my thinking. If I moved out voluntarily, I would not lose my ownership rights. But I should document the condition of the house, copy essential records, secure personal property, and avoid making informal promises that could complicate negotiations. I asked whether calm behavior at a family dinner could be interpreted as consent to terms I had not seen. She said no, provided I signed nothing. Before I left, she asked what outcome I wanted. I looked through the window at sleet sliding down the glass. I said I wanted to understand what was happening before deciding what I wanted. She nodded and said that was reasonable. but understanding sometimes arrived after a decision became necessary. The next 12 days passed with the artificial brightness of the holiday season. Garlands appeared above shop doors. The radio repeated songs about returning home. Our neighbors placed an illuminated reindeer on their lawn, where it leaned slightly to one side, because the left front leg had not been anchored correctly. Elise became unusually attentive. She bought my favorite coffee. She suggested a movie on Friday night. She rested her head against my shoulder during the first 20 minutes, then checked her phone 3 times and said she needed to respond to a donor. On December 14th, I heard her speaking in the garage. The kitchen door was not fully closed. Her voice came through the gap, low and careful. She said she had chosen Christmas because everyone would already be there. A pause followed. Then she said she could not keep pretending through another year. I remained beside the sink with one hand beneath running water. The plate I was washing had become clean several seconds earlier, but I continued moving the sponge across it. She said he needed to trust her. Another pause. Then she said, after Christmas, everything would finally begin. I turned off the tap. The sudden silence made the house feel enormous. Elise came in 2 minutes later, carrying an empty storage box. She said she had been checking whether the outdoor decorations were dry enough to pack after New Year's. I looked at the box. There were no decorations in the garage. I said nothing. That night, I understood the likely structure. She intended to announce the end of our marriage at Christmas dinner. She had chosen a room full of her relatives. Whether the audience was meant to support her, restrain me, or validate her version of events, I could not know. Perhaps she believed public disclosure would make the conversation cleaner. Perhaps she feared being alone with my grief. Perhaps the man on the phone had encouraged it. The method hurt more than the likely decision. Elise had once known me well enough to understand that I did not perform private pain in front of strangers. Turning our marriage into an announcement meant she was no longer speaking to me. She was presenting a conclusion to a room. In engineering terms, she had scheduled demolition before completing the survey. I began preparing, not for revenge, for departure. On December 16th, I rented a furnished apartment above a closed bookshop on Merritt Lane. The lease began Christmas Day. It contained 1 bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and windows that faced the clock tower above the old post office. The rent was $1,460 per month. The landlord, an elderly woman named Corinne Hale, asked why I needed the apartment so quickly. I told her my living arrangements were changing. She looked at the wedding ring on my hand, but did not ask for details. The apartment was clean and almost entirely beige. Beige curtains, beige carpet, beige sofa with 1 flattened cushion. It had the impersonal calm of a place that did not know me yet. I paid the deposit from my personal account. On December 18th, I moved several boxes into a storage unit near my office. My father's compass, my professional records, clothes. Elise would not notice missing. The hard drive containing family photographs. The small wooden toolbox my grandfather had made. I left the blue honeymoon bowl, the ceramic fox, and nearly everything we had chosen together. There is a difference between taking what belongs to you and stripping a shared life for parts. I wanted no ambiguity about which one I was doing. On December 20, I photographed every room in the house. I recorded the meter readings. I copied the deed, insurance documents, mortgage statements, and renovation receipts. On December 22nd, Amara prepared a letter confirming that I was open to transferring my interest in the house to Elise if she could refinance the mortgage and compensate me fairly for my equity. I did not intend to abandon nearly $200,000. The keys would mean she could remain in the house during the separation. They would not mean my years of labor had ceased to exist. Calm is not surrender. It is often the refusal to make permanent decisions inside a temporary shock. Christmas morning arrived clear and bitterly cold. At 7:12, sunlight reached the bedroom wall through the gap in the curtains. Elise was already awake, lying with her back toward me. I said Merry Christmas, she answered after a moment. On the dresser sat a wrapped box containing the earrings I had bought her in October. Small gold leaves, modeled after the pear tree in our garden. I had ordered them before the hotel receipt, before the transfers, before I heard her speaking in the garage. For several days, I had considered returning them. I did not. A gift given sincerely does not become false because the future changes. Elise gave me a leather document case for work. My initials were pressed into one corner. I ran my thumb across them. She asked whether I liked it. I said I did. That was true. We drank coffee beside the tree. At 9:30, her parents arrived with pastries. At 11, everyone left to prepare for dinner. Elise spent most of the afternoon upstairs. At 3:18, I placed a small overnight bag in the trunk of my car. At 3:21, I removed my house keys from the ring I carried every day. There were 3. The blue-painted front door key, the silver key for the side entrance, the short brass key for the detached garage. I placed them in my right trouser pocket. At 4:05, Elise came downstairs wearing a dark green dress. It was the dress she had worn to the Foundation's annual gala the previous year. I remembered fastening the back for her while she held her hair above her shoulders. That Christmas, she fastened it herself. She asked whether I was ready. I said yes. The drive to her parents' house took 26 minutes. We spoke only once. At a traffic light on Wintermere Avenue, Elise said she hoped the evening would not become difficult. The sentence was so close to a warning that I almost admired its efficiency. I looked through the windshield at exhaust rising from the car ahead of us. I said difficulty depended on what a person expected others to carry for them. She turned toward me. The light changed before she answered. By 5:30, the house was full. Martin poured drinks. Elise's mother, Judith, moved between the kitchen and dining room with a dish towel over one shoulder. Tessa arranged candles along the table. Her brother Nolan stood by the fireplace, showing photographs of a cabin he wanted to purchase. Everyone behaved normally, but not everyone looked surprised to see me. That distinction registered immediately. Judith hugged me too long. Tessa avoided my eyes. Martin asked twice whether I wanted whiskey, although he knew I rarely drank it. Nolan spoke quickly and stopped whenever Elise entered the room. At least 4 people knew, perhaps more. The announcement had already occurred in pieces. Christmas dinner was only the public version prepared for me. I felt a brief tightening behind my ribs. Not anger. Exposure. There are buildings whose exterior walls are removed during renovation, leaving bedrooms and staircases visible from the street. Familiar spaces become indecent when strangers can see their arrangement. That was how my marriage felt in that room. Opened before I had been told it was under construction. At 6:12, we sat down. At 6:42, the radiator knocked. At 6:47, Judith asked Elise whether she wanted more potatoes. Elise said no. Then she placed both hands flat on the table. Her fingernails were painted the color of dark wine. Her ring remained on her left hand. She looked first at her mother, then at her father, then finally at me. She said there was something she needed everyone to know before the evening continued. The room became still in stages. Nolan lowered his fork. Tessa pressed her lips together. Martin looked at his plate. Elise inhaled slowly. She said our marriage had been unhappy for a long time. She said we had grown into different people, and that continuing to pretend was hurting both of us. She said she had decided we should separate. Not that she wanted to separate. That she had decided we should. The language placed my consent inside her conclusion. Judith reached for her wine glass but did not lift it. Elise continued. She said she knew Christmas was not an ideal time, but there was never a good time for honesty. She said family mattered, and she wanted the people she loved around her, while we faced the truth. I watched the candle flame reflected in her water glass. My hearing narrowed. The edges of the room seemed to draw away from me. For perhaps 5 seconds, I became aware only of my heartbeat and the pressure of the key teeth against my thigh. Then the sensation passed. I had known the announcement was coming. Knowing did not make it painless. It merely allowed me to remain seated. Elise turned toward me fully. She said she was sorry I had to hear it this way, but private conversations between us never seemed to go anywhere. We had not had a private conversation about our marriage in months. She waited. Everyone waited. The expected structure of the scene became clear. I was meant to object. I was meant to ask whether there was someone else. I was meant to produce enough emotion that her choice of audience could be justified afterward. She could then say this was why she had needed support. My response would become evidence for the method used against me. I looked at her for several seconds. Then I asked one question. I said, "Have you already made arrangements to remain at the house?" Her expression changed slightly. She said she assumed we would discuss practical details later, but yes, she hoped to stay there for now because her work was nearby and the house had been her home too. The word "too" was accurate. I nodded. Then I reached into my pocket. The 3 keys had warmed against my body. I placed them on the edge of my white dinner plate. The brass garage key struck first, followed by the silver side door key and the blue front door key. The sound was small, but in that silence, it traveled to every corner of the room. I slid them across the tablecloth toward Elise. I said, "Then you should have these." She stared at the keys. No one moved. I told her I had arranged somewhere else to stay. I said Amara Voss would contact her after the holiday regarding the house, the mortgage, and a fair transfer of equity if she wished to keep it. The mention of a lawyer changed the air. Elise's composure loosened. She asked how long I had known. I said long enough to avoid making Christmas harder than she had already chosen to make it. Judith whispered my name. I looked at her and said I was not angry with anyone at the table, but I would not discuss my marriage as a group activity. Elise said I was making her look cruel. Her voice remained low, but the sentence carried more emotion than anything she had said during the announcement. I answered that I had not described her at all. I had only responded to what she had done. She looked around the table, perhaps hoping someone would translate the moment into the version she had prepared. No one spoke. I folded my napkin once and placed it beside the plate. Martin said I did not need to leave immediately. He suggested we all take a breath, finish dinner, and talk calmly afterward. I told him I was calm. That was the problem the room had not anticipated. Anger can be managed. It can be condemned, restrained, or waited out. Calm creates empty space around a decision. Elise asked whether 11 years meant so little that I could walk out without fighting. There it was. The emotional core, stated plainly. She had chosen to end the marriage publicly, but my acceptance felt to her like abandonment. I looked at the woman who had driven me through freezing rain when my father died. I remembered her kneeling beside me on our unfinished kitchen floor, laughing because paint had dried in her hair. I remembered holding her hand beneath the examination table while a doctor explained why Hope would need to become more cautious. 11 years did not mean little. They meant too much to reduce to a performance over cooling turkey. I told her I had fought for us quietly for a long time. I said I had mistaken silence for patience, and she had mistaken patience for permission. Her eyes filled then. I did not feel victorious. There is no victory in watching someone you once loved discover that the ending they rehearsed does not feel the way they expected. She asked whether there was anything she could say. I said not in that room. I stood. The chair legs moved softly over the rug. I thanked Judith for dinner, though I had eaten only half of it. I shook Martin's hand because he offered it. Tessa covered her mouth and looked down. Nolan followed me into the hallway. He said he had not known Elise planned to announce it during dinner. He had only known she was considering separation. I believed him, although belief no longer came automatically. He asked where I would go. I told him Merritt Lane. He offered to drive me, forgetting my car was outside. I said I would be fine. Elise entered the hallway while I was putting on my coat. The Christmas music still playing in the sitting room sounded absurdly gentle. She held the keys in her closed hand. The blue front door key protruded between her fingers. She asked whether I had planned the entire thing. I told her I had prepared for the possibility she intended to make real. She said that sounded like the same thing. I pulled on my gloves. I said planning an announcement and preparing for its consequences were not the same act. She looked toward the dining room, then back at me. For the first time that evening, she appeared uncertain. She said she had thought we would talk after. She thought I would come home with her. She thought we would spend a few weeks working out what separation meant. I asked whether she had imagined I would sleep in the guest room. She did not answer. I asked whether the man from the Meriton Hotel would wait until those weeks were over. Her face lost color. Behind her, the radiator knocked again. She asked whether I had gone through her things. I said the receipt fell from her coat. She looked down at the keys in her hand. Then she said his name was Adrian. I had not asked. She told me he worked with one of the foundation's donor groups. She said it had begun as conversations, then became something else during the autumn. She said she had not known how to stop one life before beginning another. I told her she had known. She had simply wanted the ending of one life to happen, without requiring her to stand alone inside it. She began crying without sound. I wanted to comfort her. That impulse surprised me more than the affair. 11 years of care do not vanish when facts change. The body remembers its responsibilities after the mind has released them. My hand lifted slightly. Then I lowered it. Comfort from me would have blurred the boundary she had just created. She said she never wanted to humiliate me. I looked through the open doorway at the table where our marriage had become a family announcement. I said intent did not alter the load. Then I opened the front door. Cold air entered the hallway. Snow had thickened, covering the walkway in a clean white layer. My car stood beneath the street lamp with a thin ridge of ice along the windshield. Elise said my name once. I turned. She asked whether I was coming back to the house at all. I told her I would arrange a time through Amara to collect the rest of my belongings. Until then, she could stay there. She opened her hand and looked at the keys. I said Merry Christmas, Elise. Then I left. The drive to Merritt Lane took 34 minutes because the roads had become slick. I kept both hands on the steering wheel. At each intersection, the headlights revealed snow moving sideways through the beam. Houses passed with illuminated windows, silhouettes crossing behind curtains, families carrying plates from one room to another. At 7:39, my phone began vibrating in the cup holder. Elise. At 7:43, Judith. At 7:51, Elise again. I did not answer while driving. That was partly caution and partly mercy. Anything said in those first miles would have come from the open wound, rather than the person I wanted to remain. The clock tower on Merritt Lane showed 8:06 when I parked. Corinne had left the entrance light on. A small envelope was taped inside the vestibule with my name written across it. Inside was the apartment key and a note saying she hoped the place would bring me some peace. I carried my bag upstairs. The apartment was colder than expected. The radiators had not yet fully warmed, and each breath felt faintly visible near the bedroom window. I turned on 2 lamps. The beige rooms held no Christmas decorations, no photographs, and no evidence that anyone had ever expected me to be there. I placed my document case on the kitchen table. The initials Elise had given me that morning caught the light. For several minutes, I stood without removing my coat. Then my body began shaking. Not dramatically. A fine, involuntary movement started in my hands and traveled through my shoulders. I sat on the edge of the sofa and waited for it to pass. Preparation had carried me through the dinner. It could not prevent the aftermath. I cried at 8:24. I know the time because the clock tower struck the quarter hour shortly before it began, and the half hour after I had stopped. I cried for the young woman with the green notebook, for the unfinished child's room we had never built, for the pear tree, the pencil marks on the wall, and the possibility that every ordinary Tuesday in our marriage had already occurred for the last time without my noticing. I did not cry because I regretted leaving. I cried because leaving correctly still required leaving. At 9:02, I listened to Elise's messages. The first asked me to call. The second said the dinner had gone badly, and everyone was upset. The third said Adrian had not known she planned to announce the separation that night. The fourth was 9 seconds of silence, followed by her saying she was sorry. I did not respond until 10:16. I wrote that I was safe. I said all practical communication should be by email for the next few days. I told her I would not discuss Adrian until after we had established the terms of separation. She replied almost immediately. She asked whether I hated her. I looked at the question for a long time. Then I wrote, no. Hatred would have been simpler. The following morning, I woke at 5:48 on the beige sofa. Snow pressed against the lower corners of the windows. My neck hurt. One lamp remained on. For several seconds I did not know where I was. Then the apartment returned all at once. I made coffee in a machine Corinne had provided. There was no milk, so I drank it black while watching a municipal truck spread salt beneath the clock tower. At 8:30, Amara called. I told her what had happened. She asked whether I had promised Elise the house. I said I had handed her the keys and told her she could stay. Amara said that was fine. Then she reminded me that symbolism often felt legally binding to people in emotional situations, even when it was not. She would send a letter clarifying temporary occupancy and proposed settlement options. At 10:04, Elise emailed. Her message was nearly 2,000 words. She explained the affair without quite calling it an affair. She described loneliness, distance, missed signals, and the way our marriage had become efficient rather than intimate. Some of what she wrote was true. I had worked too much. I had responded to emotional uncertainty by becoming more useful. When she withdrew, I repaired things. I replaced the leaking shower valve. I reorganized our finances. I scheduled dinners and suggested weekends away. I behaved as though a relationship could be stabilized by increasing maintenance. But usefulness is not intimacy. I could admit that without accepting responsibility for deception. Elise wrote that Adrian made her feel visible. She wrote that she had planned to tell me privately several times but lost courage. Announcing it with family present had seemed safer. Near the end, she wrote that my calm departure had frightened her, because it made her wonder whether I had already stopped loving her. I read the message twice. Then I closed the laptop. At noon, I walked through the neighborhood. Christmas Day had left the streets almost empty. Snow sat untouched on the steps of the bookshop below. A paper crown from a holiday cracker had blown against the curb. I thought about structures damaged by long neglect. There is a stage when repair remains possible, but only if everyone agrees to expose the weakness. Walls must be opened. Occupants must accept noise, dust, inconvenience, and the possibility that the final cost will exceed the estimate. Elise and I had never opened the walls. We had decorated over them. By the time she chose public demolition, repair was no longer the question. The question was whether we could separate without collapsing the parts of ourselves that had once been joined. On December 27th, I returned to Marlowe Crescent with Amara's assistant and a written inventory. Elise was at her mother's house. The blue front door opened with a temporary key she had left in a lockbox. Inside, the house was exactly as we had left it Christmas afternoon. 2 coffee cups stood beside the sink. Wrapping paper filled the recycling bin. The tree lights remained connected but turned off. I moved slowly through each room. Without Elise, the house seemed less empty than paused. I packed clothing, books, and work materials. I took my father's remaining tools from the garage. I removed 3 framed photographs of my family and left every photograph of us together. In the bedroom, her green dress lay over the chair. Her wedding ring rested on the dresser. I did not touch either one. Before leaving, I went downstairs and stood beside the pencil marks on the living room wall. The plant had been moved, exposing both lines. Elise, 5'6", January 1. Me, 6'1". No shoes, she had written beneath mine. The handwriting tilted upward. I photographed the marks, then returned the plant to its place. The legal process lasted 4 months. Elise chose to keep the house. To refinance it, she used most of the money she had transferred into her personal account, which she admitted she had been setting aside for an expected separation. Her parents contributed additional funds. She paid me $176,000 for my share of the equity after adjustments for the mortgage and renovation loan. The settlement was fair. Adrian did not move into the house. Their relationship ended in February. I learned that from Elise, not because she wanted sympathy, but because his absence affected the financial disclosure she had previously submitted. She said the reality of being with him did not match the future they had discussed. I did not ask for details. People sometimes believe the person who helps them leave is also the person capable of building what comes next. Those are different skills. Elise and I spoke in person once before the divorce became final. We met on April 9th at a quiet cafe near Amara's office. Rain moved down the window in narrow lines. Elise arrived early and wore no ring. She looked thinner. So did I. For nearly an hour, we discussed paperwork, insurance, tax filings, the remaining furniture, the blue bowl from our honeymoon. She wanted me to take it. I said she should keep it. She asked why. I told her because she still used it. Near the end, she folded her hands around a cup of tea and asked whether I had truly known what she planned before Christmas dinner. I said I had known enough. She asked why I went. I could have confronted her in advance. I could have refused the invitation. I could have spared myself the table, the silence, and the keys against the plate. I told her I went because some part of me still hoped I had misunderstood. Until she spoke, uncertainty remained. She asked whether handing her the keys had been intended to punish her. I said no. I had handed them over because she had chosen the house, the audience, and the ending. I would not make her drag me through a decision she had already staged. She looked toward the rain. Then she said she wished I had fought. I asked whether fighting would have changed her decision. She said she did not know. I told her that was why I had left calmly. A person should not have to destroy his dignity to test whether someone else is certain. She cried quietly. This time, I passed her a napkin. That was the last kindness I could offer without confusing it for reconciliation. The divorce became final on May 28th at 10:40 in the morning. No courtroom scene occurred. No one celebrated. Amara emailed the signed order while I was reviewing reinforcement plans for the Bellwether Library. I read the message, saved the attachment, and returned to the drawings. The west stairwell required 12 new steel anchors. The original masonry remained strong enough to carry them. In June, I moved from the apartment on Merritt Lane into a small house near the river. It had one crooked porch step, a narrow study, and no history attached to me. During the inspection, I found a hairline crack above the kitchen doorway. The agent apologized and said the owner would repair it. I examined the direction, width, and surrounding plaster. Then I told her it was cosmetic. Some cracks are exactly what they appear to be. On the first evening after I moved in, I unpacked my father's compass and placed it on the study shelf. I hung 3 shirts in the bedroom closet. I ate dinner from a cardboard container beside an open window, while rain moved across the river. At 8:17, my phone displayed a message from Elise. She said the pear tree had flowered more heavily than usual. A photograph followed. White blossoms covered the branches behind the house on Marlowe Crescent. Beneath them stood the garden bench we had built during our second summer there. I studied the image. Then I wrote that the tree looked healthy. She replied that it did. We did not speak again for several months. The new house came with 2 keys, one for the front door and one for the shed. I placed them on a plain steel ring without adding anything else. That autumn, I repaired the crooked porch step. I removed the board, reset the support beneath it, and fixed it back into place. The work took 40 minutes. When I finished, I stood at the bottom of the porch and tested it with my weight. The step held without movement. Behind me, the river moved quietly through the dark. I went inside, closed the door, and turned the new key once in the lock.